Hello everyone, my name's Stephen Robertson. Am I going back? There we go! Yes, we're in. Right, fantastic. I'm Chief Exec of the Big Issue Foundation, and our job is to help big issue vendors in the business of changing their lives. We help them address the issues that brought them to us in the first place or have arisen as a result of the experiences they are having, which are poverty, exclusion, and generally, if you spend your time outside, it's dealing with issues related to homelessness. It's all about business. And my personal connection to business goes back many, many years. In fact, I started my career, for anyone who's old enough to remember, in Our Price Records, which is a national music retailer. And that was a great place to work because you got to play music all day and you got to interact with the public. And one of the most interesting things about interacting with the public is when they hear records, they sometimes get the titles slightly wrong in their minds, and some of them come and ask you for them. So you get things like, "Excuse me, mate, have you got that one little red Corvette by Prince? Have you got Marvin Gaye's Central Heating?" And my all-time absolute favourite was someone went, "Mate, have you got that one, Free Nelson the Panda?" And I say, it's Mandela actually, mate. And I go, no, it's a panda. It's been in captivity for 21 years. It's terrible. So when I came out of there, after sort of 13 years or something, some charities were just connecting to the idea that their old income streams weren't always going to work in the future. And I worked for Marie Curie Cancer Care for a year, who were primarily reliant on legacy income. And they realized that sadly the same amount of people were dying, but because it was the recession, the value of people's estates were less. And so those organizations that were waking up on how to kind of run things properly decided they should employ people with business skills rather than the old model, which is if you expressed an interest in something, you were put in charge. "I think we should do some marketing. You're in charge, Sergeant Major." So I spent a year working with Marie Curie expanding their record stores. Their record stores? Their charity shops. I'm losing my place here. And then my next connection was I bumped into my predecessor at Shelter at the toilets at the Children's Society, which is a different story altogether. But he told me he was retiring. And I was lucky enough to work for Shelter for 13 years. And we had a big chain of charity stores, and we had many, many volunteers. And one of the things I used to do was go around and say, thank you for taking part, thank you for supporting us, and, you know, what is it that actually motivates you? And people would always say, almost universally, "It's because of the shelters that you run. It's fantastic." Now, of course, Shelter do many, many good things, but one thing they don't do is actually provide shelters. So again, this was people kind of misconnecting with things and, you know, what's someone to do? Now, I was approached about the job for the Big Issue, and I'd always admired it. And I think I admired it because the one thing that the Big Issue does for people experiencing poverty and exclusion is provide them with a job. Now, a little bit of a history lesson. The Big Issue is based on a concept that Gordon Roddick encountered when he was in New York some 27 or so years ago, where he was overwhelmed by the number of visible homeless people on the streets, and an individual came up to him and went to sell him a copy of something called Street News. So rather than asking for money, which everyone else was, you know, "Buddy, can you spare a dime?" here was an individual who was seeking to enter into a transaction, into a trade. Gordon bought a paper, the individual profited, and Gordon had something to read. Now, when he came back to the UK, together with Anita, his wife, they knew John Bird, our founder, now Lord John Bird of Notting Hill, no less. At that time, he was a printer. But John had left home without being able to read or write, entertained at Her Majesty's pleasure on a number of occasions, and a general ne'er-do-well with a number of issues himself, and not probably the kind of individual that you might choose to invest £500,000 or so in setting up the Big Issue magazine. But bravely or naively, that is exactly what Gordon and Anita did. Now, the Big Issue magazine has always operated on the same basis. The content is written by professional journalists. The circulation of the magazine forms the basis of the rate card. At the moment, the magazine is circulating something in the region of 82,000 copies on average a week, and that's about 5% up on the year. But that 82,000 is not what the Big Issue sells to the general public. The magazine has always been sold exclusively to people experiencing poverty and exclusion who, after their first 5 free copies, are up and running and selling the magazine with their own cash. It is a business. They invest money in it themselves. The money they don't make from the magazines they don't sell, they don't get back. And the ethos here is a hand up and not a hand out. So if you imagine, just for a moment, losing the things that are the most important to you in your lives. That might be your friends, your home, your very sense of yourself. You don't necessarily think, I know, I'm going to become a business person. I'm going to start my own newsagent without a shop. But that's what big issue vendors do. Now, the irony here is, of course, once you put on a red jacket and you hold up this, which is a piece of A4 paper with the words big issue on it, Suddenly you're not an entrepreneur. You're not a business person. You're a member of the homeless community, the drunk, the idle, the feckless, the generally worthy of my disdain. And my job is to challenge you to put your money in my homeless hand and buy a newspaper. So suddenly, I am a stereotype. I'm one of them. And it's a really hard job. In fact, some people will walk up to our vendors and say, get a job, mate. Now, can you imagine being in your office and someone walks in and goes, get a job? It's like, I'm obvious, I'm at work. So it makes it really hard because actually, when people say that to our vendors, they're absolutely at work already. Now, that job of change is all driven by people connecting with their customers. If I typify it, a new big issue vendor might traditionally spend about, I don't know, 60 minutes to 90 minutes or so is their time horizon ahead. That's all you're thinking. What am I going to do? Where am I going to sleep? How do I get out of the rain? The idea that I absolutely have to earn some money and keep it and invest something of myself in that means that I start to change myself with the public that I'm interacting with. So the connection on the street between our vendors and our customers are the things that begin to change them. Yes, it's cash, but it's also a social interaction and a very, very important social interaction. This connection that's going on the street all the time around us isn't something that we can easily promote ourselves. We have to find other ways of getting the message out. And a little while ago, we had a fantastic volunteer day where we took out a number of people from a high street bank, and it was a kind of open experience in the sense that we hadn't really planned what was going to happen. And the guy said to us, look, we are high street bankers. We know the best retail sales skills in the world. Somebody can come in to get 50 quid, and we can sell them a mortgage. So we would like to work with your vendors in and around the streets of Covent Garden so that they have the benefit of our experience, the benefit of our sales training, and they will be financially better off at the end of the day. So I had an interesting conversation with our vendors who want to work with a bunch of bankers, and they're like, oh, I'm not sure, but we'll have a go. Now, of course, what happened when these professional retailers put on the red jacket and held up the piece of A4 paper, suddenly they weren't high street professionals, they weren't retail experts, they were members of the homeless community, the drunk, the idle, the feckless, and they're generally worthy of my disdain. And what's more, people started to ignore them in a way that they didn't really expect before. Suddenly people were on the wrong side of the mobile phone, the red lines on the street were really interesting, and people had to stare at them as they walked past them. Somebody actually got asked to leave a coffee shop that they always go to because the vendor that they were with wasn't welcome there. They were really shocked. It changed minds forever. The feedback at the end of that session was incredible because this well-intended connection and good intent had actually worked in the reverse. The bankers had sales training from people who are homeless, and it changed their minds forever. And they went on to tell many, many people. In fact, we've had probably, I'd say about 3,000 or so people through that scheme already. So a really, really impressive way of working. Now, the other challenge that we have in terms of connection, of course, is that we're defined by the people that are doing the job. And that's really important because you see our vendors everywhere. There's about 1,600 or so throughout the UK at the moment. There's about 75 people in the magazine and 25 of us in the charity. We're really small, and we are defined uniquely by the work that's going on the street. You could be stood in a supermarket queue next to a Marie Curie cancer care nurse and you wouldn't know because they're not wearing a uniform. But our vendors are, and that's how people identify with them. And so for us, the really important thing, whenever we do events, is to make sure our vendors are part of it. A little while ago, we had a cycle ride from London to Paris, and I was very pleased and happy to take part in this, of course. And we had some of our former vendors and current vendors taking part with people who were cycling between here and the Arc de Triomphe, and it was an amazing event. One of the outcomes of that, of course, was that everyone connected with our vendors, and the stories that came out of that were very, very impressive. And I was kind of tired at the end of all this, so I'd ridden with one of our vendors, Dean, who was in fact a former vendor. He'd come back to show people that life does move on, that life changes, and everyone was very impressed with this. And I've got this rule that when I've kind of finished work and when I've done one of these big things, I kind of am obsessed about looking at my phone. So I have this rule that I don't, because if anyone's got a phone that's flashing now, my temptation is to start to look at it now. So I say when I'm on holiday, if anything happens, then you phone me up. Don't email me. Don't do one of those kind of passive-aggressive things that when I get back, I've got a tsunami of stuff and I should know what's happening. But if you phone me, I will pick up, I will connect with you, and I'll find out what the issue is. And I was taking a bit of time out with my partner, Laura, and my 2 children, and the phone rang. It's like, oh no, it's my colleague, Celia. And I was like, I've got to answer the phone. And my partner's saying, no, don't answer it. It's work. You're on holiday. You don't need to answer it. I said, well, I do, because I've got this rule. So I answered the phone. It was my colleague, Celia. And she said, I'm afraid it's about Dean. And I was like, oh no, what's happened? Dean is a cycle courier, former vendor, now a cycle courier, and he's a cycle courier in London. I was thinking, this sounds like really bad news. Maybe he's been in an accident, something really tragic has happened here. I said, what happened? So, well, Dean has been in the office earlier. He's really excited still about the London to Paris cycle ride. And he left the office and everything was fine. And now he's on the BBC News, having gone down the Walworth Road, and he's been arrested for throwing eggs at Ed Miliband. And it was on the front page of the BBC homepage saying, big issue vendor throws eggs at Ed Miliband. And I was saying, look, this is not a crisis. He's a former vendor. It's a success story. As Dean was bundled into the back of the police officer, Ed Miliband very bravely came and thought, I'm going to connect with you here. He said, what is it about me or the Labour Party policies that I could change that mean that you would vote for me? And as they were slamming the door, Dean just said, bring your brother back! So, big issue vendors are activists, yeah? Big issue vendors are doing a job of work. When you see somebody on the street, they've got up in the morning, they may have problems, they may have issues, they may have those problems and issues again at the end of the day. But when you actually see them on the street, they've got out of bed to do a job of work, and that job of work involves connecting with and engaging with us, the general public. And that process of engagement is the thing that really does help to change an individual. So if you see somebody out selling a copy of the magazine, the first thing I really ask you to think about is that they pay £1.25 for the copy of this magazine, and they're selling it on for £2.50. They will make a profit out of that, but those magazines that they don't sell, they won't. So they are putting something of themselves into the community, something of themselves in terms of doing a job of work, and actually is the return of you guys recognizing people and talking to them and interacting with them means that that process of change that starts with business becomes a social change for them and means they get back into housing, back into healthcare, back into finances, and actually doing a job of work. It's a very, very important way of connecting with the world. In any other homeless organisation out there, and this is not a criticism in any respect whatsoever, if you were unfortunate enough to be on the streets of London tonight, and you were helped by one of those organisations, your status would be that of a client. You would be the recipient of whatever it is that organisation chooses to do for you. In the very base term, at the big issue vendors come to us to spend their money with us. They're not clients. Their customers. In the same way as people have bought tickets for this event today, they are exercising their commercial choice. And that unique relationship that the organisation has into a population that is widely disliked and feared is something that is really, really important to us in terms of creating a body of change. Literally millions of magazines have been sold on that basis. And now as a concept, the big issue concept is around the world. We don't own them. There isn't a map of the world like in a James Bond film where somebody goes, Taiwan. Actually, people set up these organisations themselves, but they're all motivated by the same idea, and that is creating business opportunities for people to change their lives. Workplace opportunities that means they have to connect with society and connect then with their inner customer-focused person themselves. So I'm going to bring it to a close there. What I would like to say, thank you for listening first and foremost, but really you can be activists. You know, when you see a big issue vendor out on the street, connect not only with your inner consumer, connect with your inner activists, because when somebody buys a copy of the magazine, it's a great read and a great deed. Thank you very much for listening today.